I hadn't been back to this part of the state in over a decade, and walking into that lakeside wedding venue felt like willingly stepping into the jaws of a past I'd buried so deep I almost convinced myself it never happened. The weather was beautiful, the kind of perfect late summer day with warm breezes and soft golden sunlight glittering off the water like a movie backdrop, but inside me, everything was clenched and cold. Nathan, always calm, always steady, walked beside me with his hand brushing mine in that quiet, grounding way he had. Eli, our son, was holding my other hand, his little fingers sticky from the piece of chocolate he'd begged for in the car. He was asking something about the boats docked near the water's edge, pointing excitedly, but I wasn't hearing him. My eyes were fixed on the woman in white standing at the top of the flower-lined aisle, radiant, poised, and unmistakable. Lauren, my sister. My breath caught in my throat before I could stop it, and the air around me thickened, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. It wasn't just the sight of her that stunned me. It was the realization that even after all these years, even after everything, seeing her still made my pulse thrum like it used to when we were kids sneaking out of the house at night. Except now, instead of adventure, it was fury, grief, and betrayal surging under my skin. She hadn't changed much. Older, yes, and her face held the kind of polished confidence that comes with years of curated living. Her hair, once a mess of curls and chaos, was now sleek, tucked perfectly beneath a vintage-style veil. Her smile, directed towards someone near the altar, was soft, controlled, camera-ready. And then her eyes flicked toward me. She didn't flinch, but her smile froze for half a second, the corners twitching before she managed to catch it. That single glance lasted less than a moment, but it held the weight of 11 years. Every word never said, every question never answered. Nathan noticed before I said anything. He leaned toward me slightly, not needing to ask. His fingers pressed gently against my back, a silent "I'm here." I swallowed hard, blinked once, and forced my feet to move forward with a slow shuffle of guests finding their places. Eli was tugging at my arm again, oblivious to the emotional earthquake unraveling inside me. "Mom, can we go see the water after the ceremony?" he whispered, craning his neck to look up at me. I nodded, squeezing his hand because I didn't trust myself to speak. We were ushered to our seats, the coordinator guiding us to the row marked for friends of the groom. Of course, we weren't invited as family. Technically, Nathan had done some consulting work with the groom's law firm and got the invitation through that. Lauren wouldn't have known we were coming, until now. I couldn't help but look at her again as I sat. She was stunning, yes, but there was something else, something brittle just beneath the surface, like a porcelain vase with hairline cracks no one saw until it shattered. Her gaze kept flicking toward me, never fully landing, always darting away. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected me. It was strange, sitting there among strangers and old ghosts, the gentle hum of string instruments playing over the sound of guests settling in. My heart was hammering so loud I was afraid Nathan might hear it. He reached over and laced his fingers with mine, his hand warm, grounding, familiar. He didn't need to say anything. He knew this wasn't just some random wedding for me. This was the past colliding violently with the present. I'd thought about this moment for years. Not like this, not at a wedding, but in some imagined confrontation where I finally got to ask why. Why she'd done what she did. Why she'd walked away. Why she let everything burn and never once turned back. But now that she was here, now that I was here, I didn't feel powerful or righteous. I just felt hollow. The ceremony began, and everyone stood as the music shifted to that slow, dramatic swell reserved for bridal entrances. Lauren stepped forward, arm in arm with our father. That almost knocked the breath out of me again.
Dad.
He hadn't spoken to me either since everything fell apart. Seeing him walking her down the aisle, smiling like nothing had happened, like we were all still one big happy family, made something in my chest twist. He looked older, of course, hair whiter, skin more weathered, but still unmistakably him. And he glanced my way, just once, just for a second. A flash of something passed through his eyes, recognition, maybe guilt, but it vanished before it could mean anything. I sat frozen as the ceremony moved forward, every word from the officiant washing over me like white noise. My eyes flicked from Lauren to Dad and back again, trying to reconcile the people in front of me with the versions that lived in my memories. My childhood had been entangled with Lauren's like vines growing around the same fence post, close, messy, inseparable. Until everything changed. Until the fight. Until the lie. Until the choice she made, and the silence that followed. The moment the officiant said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," there was applause, cheers, people standing, clapping, taking photos. I stayed seated. I couldn't bring myself to join in. Nathan gently rubbed his thumb along the back of my hand, a reminder to breathe. Eli was clapping enthusiastically, caught up in the joy of it, and I couldn't blame him. The reception was even worse. The guests mingled by the water, sipping champagne and laughing under strings of golden fairy lights. Nathan guided me toward a quieter corner, away from the crowd, where we could watch the lake and catch our breath. But even from here, I could see her, floating between groups of guests, her dress catching the light, her laughter easy, practiced. She hadn't approached me. Not yet. Maybe she wouldn't. I could feel the stares, though. A few of the older guests whispered, their eyes darting toward me, and then quickly away. They remembered. They knew. I didn't need them to say anything. I could see it in their faces. That's the one. The sister. I didn't want to cause a scene. I didn't want Eli to see me like that. I didn't want Nathan to have to pull me out of a confrontation. But the longer I stayed, the more the weight of that unspoken history bore down on me. And then, as if summoned by the sheer gravity of my thoughts, Lauren broke away from the crowd and started walking toward us. She was slow, deliberate, her posture perfect, but I could see it in her face, the strain, the caution. Her smile was tight now, uncertain. And when she finally stopped a few feet away, her eyes scanned my face like she wasn't sure who she was looking at anymore. "Layla," she said, voice soft, testing the sound of my name like it was unfamiliar. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I just looked at her, and for the first time in 11 years, I waited. Let her speak first. Let her explain. Let her finally say something, anything. And just like that, the silence that had lasted more than a decade shattered. I stood there in the soft glow of the reception lights, still feeling the lingering weight of Lauren's voice in the air after she spoke my name. She hadn't said anything else, just Layla, as though the syllables alone might erase everything that had come before. I didn't respond, didn't give her more than a steady gaze that told her I wasn't the same girl she last saw at 17, raw, gutted, exiled from the very family now celebrating in white and champagne bubbles. But before either of us could say more, a voice cut through the space between us. It was Nathan's. He stepped forward with that quiet confidence he always carried, the kind that made people pay attention without him having to raise his voice. "Excuse me," he said politely but firmly to Lauren, who blinked like she'd just remembered she was surrounded by witnesses. "I think it's time I introduce my wife properly." Lauren opened her mouth slightly, as if to protest, but Nathan didn't wait. He turned toward a small group forming nearby, some of the groom's colleagues, a few distant relatives, some of the same people who had been glancing our way since the ceremony ended. They had that particular social curiosity that clings to wealthy events, the kind that senses a story without knowing what it is. They were already whispering. I could feel it ripple through the air, like a current under the surface. Some of them didn't know who I was at all. Others remembered what they'd been told. Whispers from Lauren, my parents, that I was the troubled one. The sister who left, the girl who couldn't handle life and ran. The high school dropout. The disappointment. The one they never spoke of again. Nathan cleared his throat lightly, enough to hush the conversation around us without seeming dramatic, and then he smiled as he placed a gentle hand on the small of my back. "Everyone," he said, voice calm but strong. "This is my wife, Layla James. Some of you may not know her name yet, but you will soon. She's the founder and CEO of Helix Health." I felt a stillness settle over the crowd like a held breath. For a moment, no one said anything, as if they were recalibrating what they thought they knew. The name dropped like a stone into the still waters of the reception, Helix Health. And just like that, a buzz began, subtle but unmistakable, threading itself from one cluster of guests to another. "Wait, Helix Health," someone murmured. "Isn't that the AI platform that partnered with Johns Hopkins? I read about her in Forbes last month. Is that really her? She's the keynote speaker at MedTech World next quarter." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I let the moment settle, the silence stretch. The same people who once pitted me, or ignored me entirely, were now staring like they couldn't reconcile the woman standing in front of them with the version they had stored in their minds. I saw an older couple whispering near the wine table, one of whom I recognized as an old friend of my mother's, leaning in close to ask the other if that was the same Layla who'd had problems back in the day. A young man in a sleek navy suit was already pulling out his phone under the table, pretending to text while clearly Googling my name. The shift was immediate and visceral. They looked at me now with curiosity, not dismissal. Recognition began to dawn in layers across the room, expressions softening, straightening, contorting into surprise, and for some, discomfort. Because the story they had clung to for so long, Lauren's version, my parents, was unraveling. In their narrative, I was the failure, the impulsive one. The girl who dropped out of high school after a public blowout with her sister, who left home in disgrace, who never went to prom, who missed graduations, who disappeared. That was the version they had all accepted. It had been repeated enough times it had calcified into truth. But now that truth was cracking. Nathan, unfazed by the stir he'd caused, continued. Helix was her brainchild. She built it from nothing. And it's changing the way healthcare is delivered, especially in underserved communities. Remote diagnostics, AI-powered triage, real-time treatment plans. She's leading the field. Just thought you all might want to know the woman you've been whispering about is one of the most respected minds in the industry. There was a pause, then a few murmured acknowledgments. I met the eyes of a woman near the bar who I vaguely recognized from childhood. She used to carpool Lauren and me to swim practice in middle school. She stared like she didn't know if she should approach or avoid me. And for once, I didn't care. Lauren was still standing there, a few feet away, unmoving. Her jaw was tight, lips pressed thin. Her eyes flitted between Nathan and me, and I could practically see her calculating what this meant, how this looked, how many people were now questioning the version of the past she had carefully curated. Her hands, still clutching her bouquet, had tensed so hard I saw her knuckles whiten. She tried to recover, smiled. Polite.
Cool.
She said something to one of her bridesmaids nearby, nodded once, then turned away and disappeared back into the crowd. I watched her go, feeling that strange mix of fury and freedom twisting through me. Not because I wanted revenge. Not even because I wanted validation, but because, for once, the truth was louder than the lies. I didn't need to shout it. I didn't need to point fingers.
It was in the room now.
It was in the shift of conversations, the sudden attention, the expressions folding in on themselves as people began to realize that the story they'd believed for over a decade was missing entire chapters. Nathan slipped his hand into mine again and whispered, "You okay?" I nodded slowly. Not because I was fine, but because I was finally grounded. For the first time in years, I felt the ground steady under my feet. I had spent so long trying to build something that would speak louder than the pain I left behind. And here it was, without me having to say a word. My success wasn't a weapon. It was a shield. Not for protection from them, but for protection from the version of myself they tried to create. Eli came running back to us then, cheeks flushed, holding a tiny dessert in his hand, and beaming like the world was simple and bright. Nathan reached down to wipe a smudge of frosting from his chin. And as I looked at my husband, my son, and the fragile but unmistakable silence unraveling around the room, I knew one thing for certain. This time, I wasn't the one carrying shame. As I stood there, watching the hushed conversations ripple across the ballroom like slow-moving waves, I couldn't help but feel the old memories rising to the surface, not gently, but like splinters pushed upward through skin after years of pressure. Every glance in my direction, every awkward smile, every double take, it all carried the same question behind the eyes. How? How did I get here? And with every murmured speculation, every crack in their once solid narrative, I felt something shift inside me, not triumph exactly, but something sharper, heavier, quieter. I remembered being 21, standing in the living room of the house I'd grown up in, clutching the thin rejection letter from Duke's financial aid office in one hand, my heart still naively hopeful that a mistake had been made. I had done everything right, my grades, my applications, the interviews, the extra credit, the community service. I had worked myself raw to earn a spot in their program. The letter, cold and impersonal, said the school had received notice that I had withdrawn from consideration. But I hadn't. I hadn't withdrawn anything. I hadn't even known it was possible. I'd gone to my parents, shaking, confused, still believing that this was something fixable. I remember my mother looking at me with that infuriatingly calm expression she wore when she was about to say something cruel but polished, like she had rehearsed it in her mind to sound reasonable. "Layla," she said, gently but with that icy undercurrent, "maybe it's for the best. You were never really Duke material. It's a high-pressure environment. You're sensitive, emotional. We didn't think it would be a healthy choice for you." I didn't understand. I kept asking questions. What about the money they promised for my tuition? The fund they'd set aside since I was 15? They had always said college was a given, an investment in my future. That's when my father, arms crossed in that same chair he always sat in after dinner, said bluntly, "That money's gone. We had to use it for Lauren's educational travel experience." Educational travel experience. That's what they called her 6-week summer in Italy. The boutique hotels, the private tours, the designer wardrobe they bought her to blend in.
I hadn't known any of that then.
I only found out months later, after a fight with Lauren that cracked the whole facade wide open. She laughed and told me she'd spent the summer spending my future one cappuccino at a time. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the lie they wrapped me in afterwards. They told the extended family, the neighbors, even close family friends that I dropped out. That I couldn't handle the stress. That I had some kind of breakdown. I remember walking into my aunt's house a year later and overhearing her say, "It's such a shame about Layla. She had so much potential, but some people just aren't built for pressure." And no one corrected her. No one ever did. That story stuck.
It was easier for them that way.
I became the family footnote, the almost, the lesson, the cautionary tale. While Lauren shined in photos, year after year, on beaches and boardwalks, in her curated Instagram captions about growth and balance, I was working 3 jobs and trying to stay awake long enough to finish my coursework between graveyard hospital shifts and closing shifts at a diner that smelled like grease and despair. I didn't tell anyone when I enrolled in community college, using what little I had from a medical transcription side hustle and the tips I pocketed under the table. I didn't tell anyone when I got certified as a CNA, when I started working nights in the emergency department, changing linens and wiping vomit off the floors while trying to memorize anatomy terms from a battered textbook I kept in my locker. I didn't tell anyone when I took on a receptionist job at a medical startup, pretending I wasn't bone tired, pretending I wasn't terrified I'd never get out of that loop of exhaustion, and barely enough. I didn't tell anyone when I used the company Wi-Fi to research how machine learning could predict early illness in patients with limited access to care. I kept my head down, mouth shut, and worked like the truth could somehow dig me out. And it did. Slowly, painfully, obsessively. I took night classes. I applied for scholarships and grants and wrote essays at 2 a.m, fueled by caffeine and spite. I coded in the dark, taught myself systems design with online forums and tutorials while the rest of my world slept. I watched people like Lauren rise on clouds of family money and charm, and I taught myself to build ladders out of splinters and burned bridges. It wasn't glamorous. There were years where I didn't know how I'd pay rent. Years I pawned gifts just to afford groceries. There were birthdays I spent alone, eating dollar menu fries in a break room while scrolling past family photos of Lauren blowing out candles with my parents, smiling on either side of her. But I kept building. I kept going. I built something from nothing. I made helix out of scraps and sleepless nights and a quiet, burning desire to never need anything from them again. And now here I was, standing in a glass-walled ballroom beside the lake, with the very people who cut me loose now unable to avoid me, unable to explain me. My name was being spoken in corners of the room where it had once been erased. The people who had nodded along when Lauren said I was too intense, too unstable, were now Googling my net worth under the dessert table. I could see the tension in their faces. The confusion, the discomfort, the unraveling of a lie they had long accepted as truth. My parents were somewhere across the room, near the groom's table, faces tight, posture perfect. I hadn't spoken to them in years. Not since I last called to confront them about the stolen college fund, and they told me, without an ounce of shame, that sometimes hard choices have to be made for the good of the family. I remember hanging up the phone and staring at the wall for almost an hour, feeling that quiet snap in my chest when love finally breaks for good. I thought I'd be more angry seeing them now, but what I felt was colder, emptier. They looked smaller, like strangers dressed in the skins of people I once loved. Nathan leaned into me slightly again, his presence grounding. "They're watching you," he murmured. "I know," I said, my voice steady. "Let them." Because this was the thing they never counted on, not just that I would survive, but that I would thrive. That I would build something bigger than any of their expectations. That the story they told about me, the dropout, the failure, the embarrassment, would one day collapse under the weight of who I had become. This wasn't revenge in the way people think. There was no confrontation, no shouted vindication, no dramatic reveal. Just the quiet, undeniable truth standing in a room full of liars and refusing to disappear. I wasn't Duke material.
No.
I was something far more dangerous. I was self-made. I could feel the tension long before I saw it. The room hadn't changed much. The same gleaming floors, the gentle clink of champagne flutes, the hum of small talk and laughter echoing beneath the soft classical music drifting through the speakers. But something in the current had shifted. It was subtle at first, like a faint tremor underfoot, the kind you don't notice until the picture frames on the wall start to tilt. I was standing near the back of the reception hall, casually sipping my drink and watching the lake shift into deeper shades of blue as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Eli had run off with a group of kids chasing each other near the garden. Nathan was chatting with an older couple I vaguely recognized from the groom's side, and I had taken a moment to just breathe. But then I saw them, Lauren and her new husband, Ryan Caldwell. They had moved into the cluster near the catering station, smiling and greeting guests like the polished, enviable power couple they pretended to be. She still wore the same tight smile, the one she used when she was trying to control a narrative. But the corners of her mouth had begun to twitch ever so slightly. She was scanning the room too often, checking reactions, watching faces.
And I knew why.
Ryan had made his way over to the same small group Nathan had introduced me to earlier, the group that now seemed unusually eager to hold my attention. A few of the guests were already asking polite but insistent questions about Helix, about the platform, our recent partnership with international clinics, the upcoming trials. I could feel their curiosity growing, their eagerness to understand how the woman who'd once been considered an afterthought in this family had become someone they were suddenly desperate to impress. That's when I heard Ryan's voice. "Wait," he said, brows raised, holding his champagne glass midair. "Did you say you're the CEO of Helix Health?" I turned toward him slowly, letting the pause stretch just long enough. "That's right." His eyes lit up with recognition, like a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. "My hospital has been trying to get a meeting with Helix for almost a year. Our chief of innovation talks about your predictive diagnostic model constantly. He called it the future of triage. You're that Layla?" I nodded, offering the smallest smile. "I am." He laughed, a short breath of surprise and admiration. "Unbelievable. I didn't put it together until just now. Lauren told me she had a sister in tech, but I didn't realize. Wow. I had no idea you were the one behind Helix." Lauren's name cracked through the moment like a shot. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch the expression she hadn't had time to smooth over. Her lips parted. Her eyes flicked between Ryan and me with the kind of panic you only see in someone who's just realized they've been caught in a lie too big to manage. Her fingers clutched tighter around her glass, and I could almost see the gears turning behind her eyes, frantically trying to calculate how to fix this, how to redirect it, how to survive the moment. Ryan, still clearly unaware of the storm brewing beside him, turned toward her with that same easy smile. "You never mentioned Helix by name. I thought it was some app your sister helped design, not an entire platform. You didn't tell me she was the founder. And here we've been trying to set up a licensing agreement for 6 months. Lauren let out a brittle laugh, and it cracked in the middle. "Oh, I didn't realize you were talking about the same Helix. There are so many startups in healthcare these days, I get them confused sometimes." Her voice was just barely steady, the words too rehearsed, too careful. Ryan didn't notice. He kept going, fascinated now. "I remember reading about your initial rollout. You used beta sites in low-income clinics instead of major hospitals, right? That was bold. Brilliant, actually. You built your data set on real cases instead of sanitized test environments. You know, I've always wondered, what led you down that path? I assumed you had a medical background." He looked at me as he asked it, but then his gaze drifted back to Lauren. "Didn't you both go to Duke?" he added, his tone casual, but laced with just enough curiosity to twist the blade. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Lauren stiffened, just slightly, but enough that I noticed the vein in her temple begin to pulse. I saw her jaw clench before she smoothed her smile back into place. "I spent some time at Duke," she said, her voice too light, too vague. "You know how it is, not all paths are linear." "Sure," Ryan said, nodding slowly. "But you graduated from Duke Med, right? You told my mom you specialized in pediatric research." There it was.
The lie.
The one I had suspected for years but never needed to call out. She'd always used it in passing, draped it over her shoulders like a designer shawl, never officially claiming the degree, but never correcting people when they assumed either. It had always been part of the image, part of the illusion she maintained with such precision.
Until now.
Until someone asked for details. Lauren opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. Her eyes flicked toward me, and I saw it. The unspoken plea, The silent wish that I would somehow rescue her, smooth over the silence, help her steer this ship back to safer waters. But I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I held her gaze and smiled, not unkindly, not smugly, just patiently, calmly, letting her twist in the discomfort of her own falsehoods. Ryan looked between us again, his smile faltering slightly as the silence stretched just a little too long. "Did I get that wrong?" he asked, his voice dipping into uncertainty now. I'm pretty sure you told me." "I attended some advanced coursework," Lauren said finally, her tone sharp, almost clipped. "Medical programs are more flexible than you'd think." I could almost hear the scaffolding groan as it started to buckle. The moment passed quickly on the surface. Someone nearby laughed a little too loudly. A waiter refilled a glass, and a burst of music interrupted the awkward lull. But the damage was done. I watched as Ryan's brow furrowed ever so slightly, the edges of his trust curling in on themselves. He didn't say anything more, but the doubt had landed. The crack had formed. And the thing about cracks, once they appear, they don't go away. They spread. It was a quiet moment, the kind that would have gone unnoticed by most in the room, but for me, it felt like the entire world paused just long enough for a truth to finally breathe. We were gathered near the long table by the bay windows, Ryan, Lauren, a few physicians from his hospital, and myself, the late afternoon sun streaming across the polished floor in angled sheets of amber light. Champagne flutes clinked, conversations hummed around us, but at that particular table, something delicate was beginning to shift. It started simply, almost innocently. One of the doctors, a well-dressed internist with a sharp mind and sharper questions, brought up our platform's machine learning feature, the part that flagged patient records based on biometric triggers and predictive markers for sepsis. She asked me how we built the feedback loop, how we accounted for variables in rural clinics where standardized data collection was still inconsistent. I explained the adaptive design of the system, how we used natural language processing to extract insights from loosely written intake notes, how we train the AI on low-fidelity datasets before moving to structured environments. The doctor nodded, impressed. Ryan was too. Lauren, standing between Ryan and the champagne tower, smiled as if she belonged in the conversation. "Oh yes," she said lightly, tilting her glass. "I always told Layla how important consistency is in clinical data. Back when we were both in med school, we used to study together, didn't we?" My breath caught, just slightly, but I said nothing. The other guests smiled, humoring her, unaware of the gap that had just yawned open beneath their feet. Ryan turned toward her, brow furrowed, and I saw the first real fracture appear in his expression. He hadn't forgotten the last conversation, the one where he'd asked about her time at Duke and she dodged. Now here she was, drawing herself into a world she had no map for. "Which lab rotation were you in again?" he asked, voice even but too precise to be casual. "You said you were in the pediatric immunology cohort, right? Was that under Dr. Frakes, or who was the PI again?" There was a flicker, fast and sharp, across Lauren's face. Panic, then performance. "Oh, it was both," she said, blinking. "It was a joint cohort that year. They were testing cross-departmental collaboration. You know how experimental Duke can be." I felt the weight of the lie land hard between them. Ryan wasn't convinced. He nodded slowly, lips pressed into a thoughtful line, and I could tell his mind was already reaching back, replaying years of stories she'd told him, details that hadn't seemed worth verifying before. The doctor beside him tilted her head. "That's odd," she said softly. "I did my residency at Duke. I don't recall any such program, and Frakes retired the year before my first rotation." Silence. Not harsh, not loud, just sharp. The kind of silence that leaves no room to hide. Lauren's eyes flicked toward me, fast and accusatory, as if I had set a trap. But I hadn't said a word. I hadn't needed to. She was unraveling in real time, pulled thread by the very persona she had crafted too tightly around herself. She opened her mouth again, but this time her voice caught, an almost imperceptible stammer, a breath too shallow. Ryan's expression changed completely then, and I saw it, recognition. Not of the truth exactly, but of the absence of it. He looked at her the way someone might look at a painting they've always admired, only to suddenly notice it's crooked. "Lauren," he said gently, "did you actually graduate from Duke?" She didn't answer. Not immediately. Her mouth moved, her eyes darted, but the words refused to land. It was like watching a window shatter inward in slow motion. Her composure, always her greatest weapon, was slipping. Her silence said more than anything else could have. And still, I didn't speak. I stood there, present, quiet, polished, just as I always had been in the moments they tried to erase me. My silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate. It was years of being told I would never make it, that I wasn't focused enough, driven enough, smart enough. That I was emotional, unstable, a poor investment. That Lauren was the one worth betting on. It was the silence of someone who didn't need to expose anyone because the truth had finally done that on its own. Ryan turned to me next slowly, as if seeing me fully for the first time. "You actually did all this yourself?" he asked, voice low but genuine. "No institutional funding? No trust?" I met his gaze evenly.
No.
Just 3 jobs, night classes, and about 6 years of being underestimated. He nodded once, slowly, the silence wrapping around us like fabric. The kind of silence that carries respect. Lauren didn't say another word. She backed away from the group under the pretense of checking on the caterers, but her hands trembled slightly, and she didn't meet anyone's eyes as she turned. I watched her retreat into the crowd, shoulders a little too stiff, the weight of her fairy tale beginning to buckle under the gravity of its own contradictions. And me, I stayed exactly where I was. Not triumphant, not vindictive. Just still. A fact standing in a room built on fiction. My presence was the answer to every version of the story they had spun about me. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The lie had finally collapsed under its own weight. The bathroom was quiet, dimly lit, the kind of overly ornate space reserved for venues like this, with gold-trimmed mirrors, cold marble counters, and artificial floral arrangements meant to feel elegant, but failing to distract from the tension pooling in the corners. I had stepped away for a moment, more out of necessity than nerves, needing space from the eyes, the whispers, the slow motion unraveling happening in the ballroom behind me. I was standing at the sink, rinsing my hands under the cool water, letting the silence press in for a breath of peace, when the door swung open hard enough to rattle the hinges. Lauren stormed in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her movements too fast, too aggressive for the carefully rehearsed image she had maintained all day. She looked wild around the edges, a storm finally slipping out of its pretty packaging. Her hair was slightly tousled, her bouquet long abandoned, and her mascara streaked faintly under both eyes, just enough to betray that she had cried, just enough to suggest that she had tried to fix it and failed. She didn't speak right away. She just stood near the door, chest rising and falling, mouth parted like she was trying to catch her breath after a sprint. I dried my hands slowly, taking my time, not because I was trying to antagonize her, but because I didn't owe her my urgency anymore. I had spent years moving quickly to keep up with her chaos.
Not now.
"You just had to show up," she finally said, her voice sharp but shaking beneath the surface. "You couldn't just let me have this day." I folded the hand towel neatly and set it on the counter before turning to face her. She looked at me like I had stepped into her dream wearing fire, like my existence alone was a threat she couldn't control anymore. Her eyes were wide, glossy, and frantic. "You think I planned this?" I asked, calm, my voice low but steady. "You think I knew I'd walk in and everything would fall apart just because I'm standing here?" "You ruined everything," she snapped, stepping forward. "Do you even understand what you've done?" "I didn't lie," I said plainly. She flinched, just slightly, but didn't look away. "I didn't invent degrees I never earned. I didn't spend a decade telling a story where someone else was the villain, so I could be the perfect daughter." Her mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but the words caught somewhere in her throat. Her hands were trembling now, and she clutched the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "They were going to know eventually," I said. "People like Ryan, he's not stupid. You can't fake it forever." "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered, the fight draining from her voice, replaced by something more fragile, more exposed. "I was supposed to marry well, keep everything polished, stable. I was supposed to fix what they couldn't fix in you." I raised my eyebrows slightly, but didn't respond. "They told me to do it," she said, quieter now, eyes flicking up to meet mine through the mirror's reflection. "Mom and Dad. After you left, they said people were starting to ask questions. That we couldn't have a family scandal, not with Dad's work, not with the committees Mom was on. They said it was better to say you cracked. That you were unstable, dramatic, jealous. That it would be easier if we just moved on from you. That you'd fade." I didn't speak. "They made me promise," she continued, her voice trembling. They said if I wanted the support, if I wanted the college fund, the connections, the freedom to build the life I wanted, I had to distance myself. And I did. I said those things. I let people believe them. And I hated you for it, even when I knew it wasn't true. She turned toward me fully now, and I could see how broken she was behind the bridal glow, the cracked foundation, the layers of performance finally peeling back to reveal someone terrified that she had bet everything on a mask and lost. You were always stronger, she said, almost like a confession. They were afraid of that. You pushed back. You didn't fit. They said you'd ruin everything we'd worked for. I looked at her then, really looked at her. Not the bride, not the golden daughter, not the curated version she'd spent her whole life maintaining, but the woman unraveling in front of me, desperate to understand how I had become everything they said I'd never be, and why she was still trying to keep up. I didn't ruin anything, Lauren, I said, my tone level unwavering. I survived what they did. I left when staying would have broken me. And then I built something real. Without their approval. Without their money. Without their protection. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't let the tears fall. You don't get to blame me for what they made you do, I added. And you don't get to make this about how hard it was for you to erase me. You chose that. But I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said again, weaker this time. It did. I replied, unmoved. And now it's yours to carry. She sagged against the counter then, as if the weight of it all had finally settled fully onto her shoulders. Her image had cracked in the most public, irreversible way possible. But still, part of her looked like she wanted me to take the weight from her, to fix it, to soften this reckoning with some sisterly mercy. But I had spent too long cleaning up after the mess they made of me. I don't need their safety, I said, softer now but no less resolute. I never did. You needed their story. I didn't. I turned toward the door then, pausing only long enough to glance back once more. I'm not here to destroy you, Lauren, I said. But I won't disappear for you either. And then I walked out, leaving her behind in the echoing silence of the room she had once believed she could control. The office was quiet that morning, unusually so, the kind of hush that settles when the rest of the world hasn't quite caught up yet. The coffee machine hummed softly in the corner, and the blinds in my glass-walled office filtered in soft streaks of pale sunlight. I had been reviewing proposals for the next Helix regional rollout, scanning line items and contractor bids, my mind calm and clear, when my assistant knocked once and opened the door just enough to lean her head in. There's someone here to see you, she said, her voice laced with something unreadable. Says he doesn't have an appointment, but he asked for you by name. I looked up, pen still in hand. Who? Dr. Ryan Caldwell. There was a pause, not in the room, but inside me. Not hesitation, just the slow, cold breath of recognition that always comes when a ghost decides to knock rather than haunt quietly. I nodded once, setting my pen down and straightening my posture, brushing a lock of hair behind my ear with deliberate composure. Send him in. He entered seconds later alone, no briefcase, no coat, just him, dressed more plainly than he had at the wedding, slacks, button-up shirt, sleeves rolled. No tie. He looked tired. Not unkempt, not shattered, just worn. The sharp, clean confidence I remembered from that afternoon on the lakeside terrace had dulled around the edges, replaced by something quieter and heavier. He carried a kind of shame now, one that came not from doing wrong, but from trusting someone who did. Layla, he said simply, and I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. He sat down without ceremony, leaning forward with his elbows lightly resting on his knees, hands clasped, his eyes scanning the room for a moment before settling back on me. I won't take much of your time, he said, voice low. I just thought you should know what's happened since the wedding. I didn't interrupt. I simply nodded for him to continue. She lied about everything, he said, almost matter-of-factly. Not just the degree. Not just the residency or her involvement with Duke. All of it. There's no license. No medical credentials of any kind. The closest she ever got to practicing medicine was shadowing a pediatrician for one summer in high school, and even that was more about appearances than interest. He paused for a moment, but I said nothing. He looked at me as if he was expecting more, shock, outrage, sympathy, but all I offered was stillness. He continued. I found the documents myself. Took me a week to gather it all. She created fake transcripts, faked letters of recommendation. Her LinkedIn page was full of fabrications. But it didn't stop there. His jaw tensed. He looked down at his hands for a second, then back at me. I spoke with someone from the office of Inspector General. They've been building a case for years. Apparently, your parents and Lauren have been involved in a long-term Medicare fraud scheme. Over 15 years. Billing for non-existent home health services, using shell companies, fake equipment rentals, even false patient data. It's been buried under layers of LLCs and manipulated records, but it's real. They started small, then scaled. Millions in stolen funds. I leaned back slightly in my chair, crossing one leg over the other, fingers folded gently in my lap. Did she confess? I asked. His nod was stiff, reluctant. Under pressure. After I confronted her with the evidence, she broke. She admitted they pulled you out of school because you started asking too many questions about the billing statements the supposed foundation's mom was running. They used your withdrawal from Duke as a cover, said you were unstable, and when you tried to dig into the numbers, they shut you out completely. I didn't respond. I'd suspected the financial manipulation for years, especially after I began my own work with healthcare systems and began recognizing the exact patterns in the fraud cases we'd helped uncover. But I had never had proof, and after so long, I stopped looking for it. I had focused instead on building something that couldn't be stolen from me. Ryan exhaled heavily, scrubbing a hand across his jaw. I filed for annulment last week. My legal team is helping the investigators. I'll testify, if needed. I'm done pretending I didn't see what I saw. He looked at me. Eyes steadier now. I thought you deserved to know. I let a long silence stretch between us, not cold but deliberate, and then finally, I spoke. I won't be involved, I said, clear and measured. Not in the investigation. Not in the press. Not in any fallout that comes from this. I've lived too many years dragging their weight behind me. I cut the rope a long time ago. I'm not picking it up again. He nodded slowly, and I saw the understanding settle into his features. They used my silence, I added. They built their version of me and counted on me staying gone. But that's over now. What happens to them is no longer my concern. I've built my life without them, and I'm going to keep it that way. Ryan stood then, no urgency in his movements, no argument left in him. Just a quiet sort of respect, the kind that comes from finally seeing something clearly. I'm sorry, he said, and it wasn't performative. For what it's worth. I nodded once, not unkindly. Thank you for telling me. And then he left, closing the door softly behind him. I turned back to my desk, reached for my pen, and continued reviewing the next proposal as if nothing had changed. Because for me, nothing had. The subpoena arrived on a Thursday morning, folded neatly inside an envelope too plain for what it carried. No fanfare. No special delivery. Just placed on my assistant's desk by a quiet courier with a clipboard and a neutral expression. She brought it to me gently, as if she could already feel the weight of it. I looked at the seal first, not the name. The Department of Justice. Then the heading. Then mine. They wanted my testimony. They were building the case against my parents and Lauren, and now they wanted what I had seen. At first, I just stared at it. Not because I was surprised I wasn't, but because after all these years of moving forward, of building distance like armor, the past had finally decided it wouldn't stay where I left it. I closed the office door behind me, sat at my desk, and let the document sit untouched beside my keyboard for a long minute, like it was waiting for me to decide who I still was. I had told Ryan I wouldn't get involved, and at the time I meant it. My life was no longer built around what they did, or didn't do. I owed them nothing. I had carved my world from stone they tried to bury me under, and I had no intention of reopening that tomb. But it wasn't really about them anymore. It had been years since I thought about those papers, ledgers, logs, records I wasn't supposed to see. I was 17 when I first noticed them. I had been helping my mother organize tax receipts one evening, back when I still believed that helping her would earn me a place at the table. She had left me in the kitchen with a box of old folders while she took a phone call in the other room. I had been instructed to sort by year. Nothing more. But I looked. I always looked. I remember it clearly. The documents were thin, clinical, filled with numbers, providers, services rendered, equipment rented. All listed under patient IDs that didn't align with the ones I recognized from the community clinic she claimed to manage. The totals were too high, the dates too frequent. I wasn't a medical billing expert, but even at 17, I understood when something didn't make sense. When I asked her about it later, she had brushed it off with a laugh, calling it practice paperwork, and told me not to worry my head about it. But her eyes had flashed cold, and I remembered that chill long after the conversation ended. I didn't confront her again, but I kept a few copies.
I didn't know why at the time.
Maybe I was scared. Maybe I was angry. Maybe I knew, even then, that the truth would one day matter more than the comfort of pretending. I stored them on an old external drive, deep in a subfolder buried beneath layers of academic notes and forgotten files, and I never looked at them again. Until now. I went home that evening, the subpoena folded in my bag like it might combust if left unattended. I sat at the edge of my bed, not pacing, not spiraling, just still. I thought of the clinics I'd passed as a kid on the way to school. The patients I'd met during my CNA years, people scraping by on fixed incomes, showing up to underfunded waiting rooms with fading hope in their eyes. I remembered an elderly man who came in every week for blood pressure checks, even though his readings had been fine for months. He said the nurse insisted he keep coming. He trusted the system. Trusted people like my mother. I powered up my old drive. The files were still there, 3 scan ledgers, time-stamped, unedited, clear. I reviewed each one with a clinical eye. No emotion. No anger. Just facts. Entries under the same provider ID numbers listed in the investigation's preliminary report. Equipment billed under multiple patient IDs in overlapping time frames. Names of companies I'd later recognize in Helix's own fraud alert database. I drafted an email to the DOJ contact listed on the subpoena. Attached the files. Subject line: requested documentation. I didn't write a message. I didn't add a signature beyond my name and number. No explanation. No story. Just the data. Just the evidence. I hit send. Then I shut my laptop, stood up, and made dinner. I didn't tell Nathan right away.
I didn't need to.
When he walked into the kitchen later that evening and kissed my shoulder, he paused for half a second, just enough to notice something different in the air. "You okay?" he asked, soft and steady. I nodded.
Yeah.
Just finished something I should have a long time ago. He didn't press. And that was it. No revenge. No catharsis. Just responsibility. The facts would speak for themselves. Our house in Seattle sits at the edge of a quiet street, where morning light slips through tall windows and lands gently across the hardwood floors like it belongs there. It's the kind of space I never imagined for myself during those years when survival was a full-time job and peace felt like a fantasy reserved for other people. Now, it's part of the rhythm of my life. Eli's school projects hang crookedly on the fridge. Nathan's books are stacked in uneven towers beside the bed. The hum of the espresso machine is the first sound I hear most mornings, followed by the soft steps of our son padding through the hallway in socked feet, always half awake, always asking for waffles. Helix runs like a living organism now, fluid, evolving, self-sustaining. I still lead every major decision, still read every report before it lands on the board's desk, still show up at field sites when no one expects me to. But I've learned the kind of leadership that doesn't require noise. I built it with my name, but it doesn't revolve around me. It serves something larger, and that's what keeps it alive. At night, after Eli's asleep and the house is dim except for the soft golden lamps in our reading corner, Nathan and I sit with our laptops or notepads or sometimes just silence between us, the kind that feels full instead of empty. The life we've built is not loud, but it's firm. It's ours. So when the letter arrived, I almost didn't notice it at first. Just another envelope in a stack of mail, credit offers, medical partnership pitches, a school fundraiser flyer with glitter still clinging to the corners.
But the handwriting stopped me.
Not because it was familiar at first glance, but because of how carefully it had been written. Each letter deliberate, measured, as if the person writing had erased and rewritten the address more than once. I stood by the kitchen counter, the late afternoon sun spilling through the windows, and turned it over in my hands once before opening it. The paper was thick, cream-colored, folded cleanly. The salutation was simple. Layla. The letter was long. Not dramatic, not overwritten, just heavy with things unsaid for too long. Lauren's voice was quieter on the page than it had ever been in person. She wrote about the choices she made, and how many of them were made not out of malice, but out of fear. She wrote about the years she spent building a life that was meant to keep our parents proud and herself untouchable. She admitted that it had been easier to let me be the family disappointment than to challenge the version of the story that kept her safe. She wrote that she knew I had been telling the truth long before anyone else did, and that the guilt of staying silent had shaped more of her life than she'd ever allowed herself to admit. She wrote about the fraud, the lies, the dinner table justifications, and the endless rehearsals of the family narrative where I was always the problem. She didn't ask for forgiveness directly, but the regret bled through every line. It wasn't performative. It was the kind of letter someone writes when they have no audience left to impress. I read it all, once, slowly, without pausing to underline or reread or react. I read it in the same room where Eli had earlier spilled juice on his math homework, where Nathan had kissed me goodbye that morning before heading to the clinic, where the windows were still warm with autumn light. The words settled somewhere inside me, not sharp, not soft, just settled. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even feel the vindication that I suppose someone might have expected. The pain was too old for that. It had fossilized long ago, layered beneath years of work, of growth, of joy that wasn't dependent on anyone's approval or recognition. The hurt had long since become part of the architecture of who I was, but it no longer dictated the design. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't display it either. I slid it into a drawer with old photographs and handwritten notes from Eli's first years, with birthday cards from friends who stayed, and voice memos Nathan once scribbled onto sticky notes when I was too tired to remember how much I mattered. Then I returned to the stove and finished making dinner. The house smelled like garlic and rosemary by the time Nathan came home. Eli was already setting the table, humming a song he half remembered from music class. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, rustling the trees and brushing softly against the windows like an old story asking to be let in again. But I didn't open the door. I had already lived that chapter. And I had more living to do. The ballroom at the summit was vast and sterile, filled with the low murmur of networking conversations and the scent of overly strong hotel coffee that clung to every corner of the carpeted space. The lighting was unforgiving, bright, clinical, and designed more for visibility than atmosphere. I stood near one of the side tables, scanning the final schedule on my phone while waiting for the next panel to begin. I had just stepped off stage an hour earlier. My keynote focused on cross-system data integration and rural patient outcomes. There had been polite applause, follow-up questions, a few handshake promises of future collaboration. It was the kind of day I had grown used to, structured, efficient, full of faces that blurred together into the larger machine of the industry. I wasn't looking for her. I hadn't thought about her in weeks. The letter was still where I had left it, folded in its envelope, filed away in the back drawer of my desk beneath old memories and handwritten math notes from Eli's second-grade binder. But as I lifted my eyes across the room, scanning the sea of lanyards and navy suits, I saw her. Lauren. She stood near the edge of the exhibitor floor, pressed back slightly from the crowd like someone still debating whether to step in fully or slip away unnoticed. Her ponytail was tight, face pale beneath carefully applied makeup, eyes darting from one booth to another as she clutched a slim leather folder to her chest. I recognized the look before I even registered her presence. It was the expression of someone trying not to fall apart in public. She hadn't seen me yet. Her lips were slightly parted, her jaw tense, as if she were bracing herself before entering a room she knew might not welcome her. Then our eyes met. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no dropped papers, no cinematic moment of frozen time. Just a glance that held for a second too long. Her eyes widened, not in shock exactly, but in resignation. She knew I would be here. Or, at least, she had feared the possibility. She didn't look away immediately, nor did I. The weight of everything unsaid passed between us like static, not hot, not sharp, just heavy. She held the folder tighter. I saw the summit's logo printed across the top of the application tucked inside. A pitch form? Probably. An innovation submission. Her name likely scribbled across it in the same careful handwriting she'd used on the letter. There was no trace of the bride in her now. No trace of the daughter they had raised to shine. What stood across from me was someone stripped of performance, just trying to find a foothold in the space she had once helped block me from entirely. And I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel pity. I felt distance. A clean, necessary distance forged from everything we had both survived, but not together. She didn't move toward me. I didn't move toward her. In that small, suspended moment, we exchanged only one thing, recognition. Not of what we once were or what we could be, but of what was true now. I had walked through fire, and she had watched. She had stood on the other side of the line they drew, and held the match. Now, years later, she was alone with the ashes and trying to rebuild something from what remained. But some bridges collapse so completely they can't be walked back over. Not out of anger, not out of cruelty, but because the foundation is gone. You can forgive from a distance. You can even understand. But not every story requires a reunion. She blinked once, offered the faintest nod, and turned away. I exhaled slowly, tucked my phone back into my bag, and walked toward the next meeting room, letting the crowd swallow the moment behind me. Some chapters don't end in punctuation, they end in space. And sometimes, space is the clearest resolution of all. The contract sat open on the long walnut table in the boardroom, the language precise, deliberate, and binding in all the ways that mattered. My legal team had already reviewed every line twice, the foundation partners had approved the disbursement structure, and the university committee had signed off on the final terms. All that remained was my signature. I held the pen loosely for a moment, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood the weight of what I was about to make real. The ink would dry quickly, but the meaning behind the gesture had taken years to form. The scholarship wasn't born from a desire to be seen. It wasn't a press strategy or a branding maneuver or a final note in some tidy redemption arc. It had nothing to do with press releases or photo ops. In fact, I had instructed the communications team to keep it out of the media entirely. No interviews. No announcements. No headlines. I didn't want this to be a monument. I wanted it to be a door. The James First Gen Medical Scholarship was a name I chose carefully, not because it honored my family, but because it reclaimed the one thing they had tried to define without me. My name. They had buried me beneath it for years, used it to lend weight to lies and silence. Now, I was putting it back in the world on my own terms, attached to something real, something earned, something that would live far beyond the confines of bloodlines and bitterness. 20 students. Full tuition. Housing, meals, books, travel. A mentorship program built from the ground up, not just with professionals, but with alumni who had once navigated those same uphill paths alone. No performance essays.
No tests designed to weed people out.
No strings, no fine print. Just access. Just belief. Because I remembered what it was like to sit in a too-small apartment filling out financial aid forms with a phone bill overdue and a manager texting me mid-application to ask why I wasn't on the night shift. I remembered professors who looked through me, offices that couldn't find my paperwork, doors that closed because I didn't know who to ask. I remembered calculating how many hours I'd need to work just to cover one textbook. I remembered what it meant to feel invisible and not be able to afford to complain. And so this wasn't a gift. It was a blueprint. I signed the contract slowly, firmly, writing each letter of my name with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. There was no trembling, no uncertainty, just a quiet sense of finality, like something long overdue had finally been made right. When I finished, I set the pen down and exhaled. Across the table, one of the program directors smiled, then reached for the envelope that held the first round of acceptance letters. We had chosen the students already, some from rural towns where no one had ever applied to medical school before, others from urban public schools where counselors managed caseloads too large to offer real guidance. One had been working nights in a hospital kitchen while taking community college classes during the day. Another had been translating medical paperwork for her parents since the age of 9. Their stories weren't identical to mine, but they carried the same fire. They weren't legacy students. They were the beginning of new legacies. Later that evening, at home, I told Nathan and Eli over dinner. Not with fanfare, just in passing, somewhere between bites of roasted vegetables and a conversation about volcanoes for Eli's science project. I finalized the scholarship, I said, and Nathan paused long enough to meet my eyes, a quiet kind of pride settling between us. Eli didn't understand the details yet. He just said, "Is that the thing where you help people go to school?" I nodded. "That's the one." He thought for a second, then smiled. "That's cool. Can I make the logo?" I laughed, the sound genuine and soft, and reached over to ruffle his hair. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet and I sat with my laptop in my lap and a blanket across my legs, I opened the folder of letters again. Some were handwritten, some typed. Each student had sent a note with their application, not required, but offered. They weren't essays. They weren't rehearsed. They were just raw, grateful, aching with potential. I read every single one. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't anger, wasn't grief, wasn't defense. It was peace. Not because the past had been undone. It hadn't. But because the future I had fought to reach was now opening wider than I ever thought possible, and this time, I wasn't walking through it alone. I was holding the door open behind me. The soil was warm beneath my fingers, crumbly and dark, with the faint scent of earth rising every time I pressed a trowel into it. The late afternoon sun filtered through the soft veil of clouds overhead, painting the garden in a golden haze, and somewhere nearby a bee hovered lazily over a patch of lavender, circling before drifting off toward the wild rosemary at the edge of the yard. Eli knelt beside me, his knees already dirt-streaked, hands deep in the planter box as he tried to find the right rhythm of pressing and patting, his small brow furrowed in intense concentration. "You can't crowd them too close," I said gently, guiding his hand as he reached for another sprig of young basil. "The roots need room to stretch out. If you plant them too tight, they'll fight for space and light, and none of them will grow the way they're supposed to." He looked up at me, lips pursed in thought, and then back down at the patch of soil where he had pressed 3 plants too close together, shoulders sagging just a little as he muttered, "Oops." I smiled, brushing the back of my hand across his cheek, leaving a faint streak of dirt in my wake. "That's okay. We'll move them. The roots are still young. They can handle a little change." He nodded seriously, already reaching to dig again, his hands clumsy but determined. The simplicity of the moment was so complete it felt sacred. There were no phones buzzing, no calendar alerts blinking, no conference calls waiting. Just us, the garden, and the afternoon humming around us with the kind of stillness that used to feel impossible. Nathan stepped into the yard a few minutes later, barefoot on the stone path, a pitcher of lemonade in one hand, 2 mismatched glasses in the other, ice clinking softly as he walked. He said nothing at first, just smiled at the scene unfolding before him. Eli halfway buried in planter soil, me sitting cross-legged in a faded pair of jeans and an old tank top, hair pulled back, hands stained with dirt and rosemary. He poured the lemonade without a word, setting one glass beside me and the other near Eli, who only paused long enough to take a gulp before returning to his mission. "Looks like he's got your work ethic," Nathan said finally, settling onto the bench at the edge of the yard with a quiet exhale. "Let's hope he doesn't get my habit of trying to fix everything at once," I replied, smiling softly.
We didn't need more than that.
The silence between us wasn't absence, it was understanding. I watched as Eli scooped another handful of soil, his little fingers pressing it around the delicate stem of the new plant, mouth slightly open in concentration. He was so full of energy and potential and joy, none of it manufactured or performed. There were no expectations loaded onto his shoulders, no comparisons to siblings, no careful curation of who he was supposed to become. He had space, real breathing space, to grow the way he needed to, and that was no accident.
It was a choice.
My past had been filled with rooms lined with crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths, with people who smiled like mirrors and lied like it was polite. It had been a theater of expectations, of roles assigned early and boundaries drawn in silence. There had been performance and betrayal, disapproval dressed as concern, and affection doled out in exact, measurable amounts. But that world didn't live here anymore. Not in this garden. Not in this house. I had pulled those roots out long ago, with bloodied hands and a cracked voice, and planted something new in their place, something quiet, something steady. I looked around at the rows of herbs, the tomatoes climbing their wooden trellises, the marigolds blooming defiantly in the corners. Every plant here had been chosen, nurtured, given space to thrive. Not because I wanted a perfect garden, but because I understood now that growth wasn't just about resilience, it was about room, about air. About being allowed to take up space without apology. That was the legacy I wanted Eli to grow up knowing. Not polished facades or whispered corrections, not pressure disguised as pride. Just truth. Just presence.
Just this.
He reached over with another seedling in hand, holding it out to me like an offering. "Where should this one go?" he asked, eyes bright, dirt smudged across his cheek. I took it gently, cradling the fragile roots between my fingers, and pointed to a spot a few inches away. "Right here," I said. "It'll have enough light and space to grow." He nodded and pressed his fingers into the soil. And I watched him, surrounded by light and soil and air, and knew that everything I had been through, the silence, the betrayals, the fire, it had all led here. Not to some grand redemption, not to applause or reconciliation, but to a patch of earth, a boy's laughter in the sun, and a life built not to impress, but to last. This was the future I had chosen to grow. And it held.